BPDA and the contracts as well. So let's get right into it. I know you wanted to start, Evan.
Yes, so I know you listened to our episode, I think last week, and we really did a deep dive into the budget. I don't want to belabor it too much, but I kind of just wanted to get your sense as somebody who was there. So, what was it like leading up to that vote? What were some of the pressures that you were facing, and why did you ultimately decide to vote against the budget?
I've been on the council now. This is my seventh year, and so seven budget cycles of memories and experience and understanding what gets said, sort of what promises are made, and then looking back on 6 years before this as well. So this year was markedly different in a number of ways. Of course, there was unprecedented levels of outreach to the council from the public. We had activists and residents and constituents out in the streets demanding change and also reaching out to us, tens of thousands of emails. We've never gotten that type of outreach before. And so there's a sort of basic responsibility of, are we representing our constituents? Are we responding to this moment? But there was also outreach on the other side to pass the budget in unprecedented ways before, of city employees, junior level city employees reaching out of fear that their jobs were being potentially cut, having gotten that information from their supervisors, and a lot of pressure from nonprofits and others who, and looking back on the records, have been connected with donations from receiving donations from the Boston Resiliency Fund. So there was just this level of outreach in all different ways, but matched, an effort to match what was happening in the streets with a real, what frustrated me, made me incredibly angry, a real level of fear mongering from the part of the administration too.
And so you mentioned something, and I kind of promised Lauren I wouldn't do too many follow-ups with the budget just because we did spend 2 hours on it, but that you were receiving from junior level employees were reaching out to you. And one of the levels of my frustration was that we really didn't know who was going to be affected if there was a shutdown. And we found out from a staffer that basically you were shown a spreadsheet a few days before from the mayor's office, kind of outlining who's going to lose their jobs and all this.
So to be clear, not all of us got that.
Okay.
I did not get it. I think they know that if I'd gotten it, I might have turned right around and that would have been would have been out there. But I mean, even that is just an example of how much distortion was happening of the reality. I think it's undeniable that had the events of the last 4 weeks, 6 weeks happened back in February instead of May into June, that a majority of the council would have said we need to respond in a different way than we're responding. But the majority that we had, some people felt like we were out of time, even though we were technically not out of time. And I think there was disagreement about whether taking a little bit of extra time was A, realistic, B, wise, C, going to lead to something different. I know, just from 6 previous cycles in the budget, that is the fastest and most effective way to make sure that we are delivering as counselors, is to have that public leverage backing us up. And we had never had it like this before. And so to let that go, it just was an incredible slap in the face, I think, to so many activists. But at the same time, we were not having an honest conversation about what would happen if we voted no on the budget. We were not having an honest conversation about how the state goes to a temporary provisional 1/12 budget regularly, and how we were not committing to 12 months of a 1/12 budget, but just a little more time to evaluate and have that conversation, how we would have had it if that happened back in February.
Oh, absolutely. And so, in response to the budget vote, and we'll call it the moment, I think the mayor, Martin Walsh, I always like that when he writes his name Martin Walsh when he publishes things, but we're just used to calling him Marty. He announced 3 big changes as what he was trying to do as, meet the moment. One of which was the creation of a new cabinet position. The other was a zoning amendment to try to fight back against some of the displacement, and we'll talk about housing in a little bit. But the third was this racial equity fund. And I know you wrote an op-ed that I have here addressing it. So to start us off on this issue, can you talk about what this fund is and what are some of your problems with it?
Yeah, I got to the point where I felt like it was important to speak out. And this is somewhat about this particular announcement and fund repeating a pattern that we've seen now. I think this was the 7th fund that's been created in the last 3 or so months. Each time the announcement meant to signal some sort of big movement happening within City Hall, a response to the moment, as you say. But this fund was like the Boston Resiliency Fund, one where we're creating this mixed set of incentives by putting City Hall and specifically the mayor and his administration as gatekeeper to private money flowing through now the mayor's office. And so the fund, like the Resiliency Fund, is set up to solicit donations from private donors, corporations, and individuals, and then through some decision-making process decide how to allocate the money raised out to nonprofits. The Resiliency Fund, has been touted as a way to direct $32+ million, but we saw very clearly in the budget that when City Hall was in charge of allocating that, it changed the political process. It directly influenced who felt comfortable speaking up, what they were saying, who didn't feel comfortable speaking up, and I heard that publicly and privately from nonprofits and from others. And so, you can argue that the Resiliency Fund is something that it addressed an extraordinary need in an unprecedented, unexpected moment. I actually think that it's not serving any need that our nonprofits weren't stepping up to do, and there's a role for the city to push, philanthropy or what, through other channels. But the Resiliency Fund is now about, okay, we're going to address structural racism through an ongoing commitment to fundraising and dispersing funds and potentially permanently changing the political process.
And I have 2 follow-ups on that, and Lauren hit me when I'm talking too much. So the first is you brought up nonprofits. And when we were doing our episode last week, we had a call in who said that a friend of his who works for one of these big nonprofits, that person almost resigned because they found out that their director was lobbying council members to vote yes to pass this budget. And you wrote something in your op-ed that I really, really appreciated. Basically, just, of course, this is for the audience who like podcasts and can't read op-eds. But not only does this create pressure on corporations and individuals with business before the city to donate, going further, nonprofit organizations must compete for dollars that now flow through the city, taking care to maintain favor with the Walsh administration, facing pressure to speak up or stay silent on the right issues. And that was something you just addressed. So, because a lot of people, when they hear nonprofit, they think, oh, that's completely outside of City Hall, that's outside the political process. But there really is a intense relationship between nonprofits and the city. Can you elaborate on that from your experience in the city council, and really just stressing again why this fund is problematic in its relationship with nonprofits?
Yeah, and it's not just this particular racial equity fund. It's Resiliency Fund. It's anytime we are setting up the city to, one, redirect money, that private dollars that could be flowing through organizations with much more skill in disbursement and accountability and that kind of expertise. I think we could have a separate conversation about philanthropy and what comes from that. But when the city does it, when city government does it, we are creating pressures that we saw in the budget, right? There were numerous, I like to hear from everyone, right? So my job, whoever wants to reach out, I'm grateful, even when people are angry, even when they disagree. That is the role, is to receive that outreach. But it was curious and concerning to see so many emails or outreach that said, on suggestion of this or that city employee, I'm asking you to support the budget because I believe in, food access or whatever, or supporting residents experiencing homelessness. And then when you go back to the spreadsheet of who received a donation, finding that was linked, and not that I'm not ascribing ill intention on any part to any of the nonprofit executive directors or those who reached out, but there is a subtle changing of the dynamic when people know that when they respond to City Hall in a certain way, it comes with a check versus when they don't, and when then they're later called on to do something. Maybe it's not a big deal to them, but it just it's corrupting is what it is.
So like that's a great like ending word or phrase for it, because as you just said, it's not that we are saying these nonprofits are evil or that these employees are like acting with ill intention. It's they are facing a realistic reaction to pressure, which is I'm going to lose my funding, we're going to lose our jobs, and the people that we cater towards won't be helped. I have to not speak out about this issue. Or maybe I need to like rub elbows with Marty Walsh or some of his handpicked people because I know that is where our funding stream is. So it creates a subconscious pressure.
When, in fact, it's not that. I mean, I think it'd be a slightly different conversation. I think we would still have it, but it would be a slightly different conversation if City Hall weren't doing this, this wouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not that this is the only option. There are plenty of other better options, better ways of getting much needed funding to organizations doing the work. But when City Hall steps in, we suck it all over through government in this way that is also harmful.
So that was actually one of my questions was, what do you propose we do to improve racial equity as this it seems like you don't actually serving its purpose.
Right. And there's a long history of government in general and the city of Boston in particular. I love Twitter because the most random of information flows your way, but a professor who is writing a book about the history of Boston city government and these funds that were created to really say that we were doing something. And, you know, not every dollar makes a little bit of difference, but when you are doing that, when you're stepping into that world, instead of owning up to the real structural change that sits solely on the shoulders of those in power and government to do, that is harmful. And so in this case, yes, we need more funding to communities of color. We need more funding to Black-led organizations and Black and Brown communities. But there was also a new Commonwealth Fund set up led by Black and Brown business leaders. If the mayor wanted to make sure there was more funding, direct it that way, right? Speak up, support that organization. And then what we do on city time, what we do with city energy is change the procurement process, right? Introduce equity in how we spend city money. You know, we crunch the numbers. Out of all the millions of emergency COVID dollars spent in this by the city of Boston, one business owned by one Boston business owned by a person of color got a contract. That was it, and that it was about a 1.8% of the total spend went to that business. In fact, all Boston-based businesses only made up 4.75% of that total spend. What else can we do? Zoning, planning, development, right? Going back to the affordable housing question, our schools really thinking about deep structural change there instead of, you know, recently we saw a task force commission that had been set up to review the exam for the exam schools, came out with their hard recommendation, and then 2 days later, you know, it turns out that again it was all set. You know, feels like it was all set up for show. You know, there's a long list of things. The city budget, right? That itself should be a $3-point-something billion racial equity fund right there.
Right. I love how you said back to the affordable housing question that I don't even think we've asked yet.
No, not yet. That's coming. And,
but like, that's a good segue.
I worked in Boston Public Schools for roughly like 6 to 7 years. So the second you mentioned exam schools, I have to like train myself to not talk too much about that. But if we have you for longer, I'd actually love to get your input on exam schools. But you just brought up a statistic that out of the city funding, only one or maybe equaled 1.8, you said, % of the COVID relief from the city went to a person of color owned it. Is that correct?
Boston-based.
Boston-based.
Yep. So anyway, we can get into details. Go ahead.
But so that made me think, because I know for the COVID relief, already set up a similar fund for COVID, which raised the $32 million, and he was touting that in what looks to be a response op-ed to yours, saying that, you know, this was a great system, $32 million raised, we dispersed $22 million to 300 different community nonprofits. Do we know, though, who got what money and what that process looked like for who was awarded?
So, in fact, along with two of my colleagues, Councilors Julia Mejia and Ricardo Arroyo, we had submitted what's called a 17F order. That's a technical name for a city council internal subpoena to the administration, because that had not been public. And so a few weeks ago, we got back the information. So I have the spreadsheet, happy to share and pass that along. It hasn't really been
that would be interesting.
Dissected publicly yet. But we have the list of who gave. in what amounts, and then who received the donations, and then some description of what the process was like.
Because that is always part of, like, I share your same critique of, and you expressed it beautifully. I'm going to bring it up in 1 second, but basically that these funds almost sidestep a much more transparent process, which is why we have government, of the collection of funds and the allocation of funds. And just to sidestep it, we now are in a situation where you had to audit the mayor's office just to see who got the money. And I think, especially our viewers, can just see why that's not a good system. And
in fact, one thing to point out, I think I mentioned it in the op-ed too, is that the normal process of oversight involves the city council, right, as the sort of democratically elected legislative side. Every expenditure that the city makes supposed to flow through some oversight from the council. And so every time the city gets an external grant to do direct services, right, let's say we are taking in there's a bunch of different examples for the schools, or for law enforcement, or for various other, let's say FEMA gives a grant to do emergency management preparation. Before the emergency management department can actually use that money, the city council has the option to hold a hearing, and then we take a vote on it. But when these funds are set up, and it's just the city becomes a pass-through to nonprofits, so we're not actually spending the money technically, we're giving it to nonprofits to disperse. That doesn't involve city council oversight at all.
So we have the lack of city council oversight. We have I'll call the phrase a shady fund, and by that I just means it operates in secret. And we have all these pressures for nonprofits.
And it's like private donors?
Private donors, people with business with the city, all have now this internal compulsion. Well, I have to give the Marty's fund, otherwise I might not get this license. And my favorite sentence in your op-ed, which I'm going to try to use as a transition to our favorite topic, which is housing. You write, centralizing private funding in the hands of the mayor and his personal appointees also means consolidating power in the status quo by continuing to rely on the judgment and control of a select few who have personally benefited from these systems over decades in Boston. We could probably spend the entire hour just on that one sentence. I had
to fight to keep that in. I went back and forth with the editors. I was like, I could defend this.
No, it's interesting to hear that the editors of the Globe are just like, oh, do you want to say? It's just like, this is the mildest critique, which is very...
I'm not surprised.
I mean, especially some of the things that passes their muster for the Globe op-eds. But sparing that, you mentioned consolidating power, and we spent probably 2 hours of that episode about the city budget really talking about what people seem to be the role of a city council member, and I think that might be a good ending question, but also what people's theory of power was. Mm-hmm. And what I took from this sentence is your awareness of consolidating power in a handful of people in a secretive process is not good. And I kind of want to take that to now address, again, our favorite subject of housing, because it seems like housing in Boston is also a very secret process controlled by a select few people. And there was a number of reports that just came out, and I'm sure you know the statistics far better than I am. So in case there's anyone listening who is not familiar, can you just tell them, how is Boston doing with affordability in housing?
So all of these issues were already at crisis level before COVID, but now we have just seen how stark it is. And so we're talking about a tsunami of evictions coming, which will hit Black and brown residents far worse. We're in the scale of tens and 20,000 evictions potentially after the moratorium might be lifted. We're talking about randomized testing of tenants based on whether someone had a white sounding name or a black sounding name, and the level of discrimination that is obvious in Boston's housing market, private housing market. We're talking about a city gentrifying rapidly, multiples in communities of color, and all of this on top of the public health crisis.
It's a lot. And I think there was just a report, we are the third most gentrified city in the country. As you were just saying, 70% of people of color face discrimination just looking for housing, if you are even lucky enough to afford it. However, though, we have the BPDA, and they are equally confident that they can solve this. So almost comically, coincidentally, on that same Thursday that the mayor announced his big changes to combat racism in Boston, the BPDA also announced two big changes that they're hoping to address, as you said, this tsunami of evictions. I think City Life put it at maybe roughly 20,000 that we're anticipating. And their big two ideas mimicked what the mayor said. One was to hire a new director for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the second was to create their own fund, an equity and inclusion fund. And as part of their fund, they are saying that they will raise anywhere from $1 to $2.7 million a year to combat affordability housing. As someone who's an expert on housing in Boston, which I'm just going to say you are, can we solve affordability in housing with $2.7 million a year in a fund controlled by the BPDA?
All the good topics here. I mean, it's hard for me to really engage on the BPDA, sort of the validity of their actions, the potential effectiveness of what they do, because I just think we've had such a long history of undeniable disconnect from what residents actually want. I really believe that at the base, at heart of so many of the disparities and inequities that we experience in Boston is our lack of planning. Right? We have an agency that still is technically called the Boston Redevelopment Authority. Right? They underwent a very expensive rebranding a few years ago and added planning to their name, but that's their DBA. They still are technically the BRA. They're technically under the same power structure as they were created in the 1960s to gentrify communities and bring about rapid scale development. Our city zoning code still dates back, the base zoning code still dates back to 1965, because we are not engaging our residents in a process of understanding what the need is and then how we make trade-offs as a city through government. Instead, everything is parcel by parcel, exception by exception. And again, that's when you get into situations where, when you're in the know, when government is the gatekeeper for either funds or the permits that lead to profits, it's incredibly distorting and corrupting.
And so, as part of those big three proposals that Marty Walsh named that I mentioned earlier, one of which was this new equity standard amendment. And I know that this is something that the city council has been working on.
Yeah, Councilor Edwards.
You were also part of an op-ed, I think maybe June 4th, it looks like, that you submitted for this. So I have some questions / challenges to it, but I would like you to explain. Can you just share what is the equity standard amendment and why you support it?
Yeah, so this is something that Lydia Edwards has been pushing for multiple years now. The federal government, I don't know, years ago now, I think under the Obama administration, second Obama administration, anyway, a number of years ago, put forward the requirement that local housing authorities should be what's called AFFH, right? Affirmatively furthering fair housing. So we're looking not just at the lack of discrimination, but whether we are taking into account affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the Boston zoning code does not include fair housing as a way that we are judging whether projects are should be approved or fit the needs of communities. So this would begin the process of actually legalizing that and incorporating it into our code.
And if somebody asked me, would you vote for this? I would say yes, absolutely. Like, I agree with you. And I know, we have codes for environmental impact, so on and so forth. I wouldn't call it a criticism. My one concern, and I don't think you're saying that this is going to solve all of Boston's problems, is that, I just mentioned environmental impact. We've been doing environmental impacts for decades. That has not stopped our air, our land, or our water from being polluted. And just having what I fear will be another just checkbox. Did you conduct a gentrification study? Yep. Okay. Approved. That it does not threaten or challenge the power dynamic, which is the BPDA, because they have their own pressures, being in how our city raises funds. Like, we have pressures to increase property value. Like, we all understand that. But if it does not change who gets to make this decision, I do not think it's going to do much to actually solve housing abolish.
Yep, that's totally right. That's why we need to abolish the age.
Perfect segue.
Yes.
I'm going to try to get us to pivot.
We need a true planning department that is accountable in the same way that other city departments are accountable. We need an independent planning commission to go back to what we had before urban renewal and this sort of mass push for development stripped away all of those planning powers and put them into the BRA.
So I think last year, I'm going to call it October.
October, yeah.
You released 70-page Abolish the BPDA article. I reread it this weekend. It's fantastic. I read it every night before I go to bed.
It's his Bible.
So, but before we talk about it, because I've been involved in housing issues maybe just the past 2 years. So I've had to have a whole education about the BPDA. Can you explain, and this is something that I learned a lot from reading your report, just what is it? You talked about the rebranding, but also how it's funded, because I found that to be fascinating as well.
Yeah, so, okay, I will try to condense 70 pages to 30 seconds, but a brief history is that in the 50s into 60s, all across the country, cities were setting up what are called urban renewal authorities. And the idea is that there was this sort of narrative that cities were the place of urban decay. Folks were fleeing out into the suburbs. You know, I think if you ask a lot of the residents who were living there then, there were many multi-racial, thriving, working class, communities there. But the narrative became, we need to restore business development back to city centers. And so the federal government began reimbursing local municipalities 100% of the cost to clear entire neighborhoods. Right, the city would use eminent domain, take the property from residents, compensate them at quote unquote fair market value, and then get reimbursed to level all the houses. And then private developers were reimbursed, I think it was up to 90% to build something new there. And that something new had to be according to some plan that these urban renewal authorities would approve. Boston really made national headlines when our application of that turned into the West End, where we had the official count was 12,000 some families. I've heard from families who lived there then it was much closer to 20,000 people, low income, working class, multiracial, immigrant families pushed out with the promise that they would be able to come back for new housing and better, but it was not enough, and it was not affordable. And so we still look at the West End today, see all those high rises, and it feels very different than I think that tight-knit community that used to be there. Because of that experience, okay, sorry, I'm wrapping up the history. Okay. Because of that experience, other cities around the country, the federal government abandoned the program, right? So the reimbursements were no longer available. Other cities started to disband their urban renewal authorities, and Boston actually went the other direction. So instead of taking ours down, we took down our planning board, collapsed the powers into it when Ed Logue came to Boston, right? Ed Logue is the larger-than-life figure who was responsible for the Supreme Court decision in New Haven called Kelo, which established the right for government to take private property and use it essentially for private development if you deemed that development as a public purpose. But previously, it had to be a truly public purpose, right? Affordable housing, open space, etc. So he came, kind of masterminded that move in Boston, where we consolidated planning and development into this super agency as other cities were moving a different direction. The other big milestone along the way is that it used to rely on some city funds. So it used to go through the city council budget process like other agencies. But in the 1980s, the director persuaded the city to move it off of the city budget. We're going to use our own leases, rents, sale, profits that we get from selling BRA owned property to self-fund. And in that way, we don't need anyone looking over our shoulder about what we're doing.
Yeah, the funding of this organization is like the poison pill of it, because it almost is now within the interest of the agency to do what is almost exactly the opposite of what is in the public interest. And to have that funding mechanism that I only learned from reading your report is horrendous beyond our belief.
They have a very nice website.
They do. They have a great website, the BPDA.
If you abolish the BPDA, just take their website.
But
Good maps.
Yes. Look at all
something
this data.
something else I learned as part of your abolish the BPDA is that their contract is coming up. I think in 2022.
22, yep.
And so, how can we help you not renew that contract?
Yeah, so to be totally clear about what this contract is, this is the state's grant of power to the agency under what are called urban renewal maps. So technically that power accrues to the agency through these drawn out geographic areas. And, you know, the BRA, we went through this right after I first joined the council, because usually, so going back to the history, when this power was created, people knew at that time that this was extraordinary power, like to overstep community process, to have one agency without votes of the city council and this and that, making these decisions. So they said, we're only granting this to you for 10 years at a time. And 10 years was renewed for another 10, and all of a sudden we were at 2016 or so. Maybe it was 2015, and then they extended for one more year. So then in 2016, the council said, we're not doing another 10 years. At that point, it felt kind of like the budget process where they said, it's too late. If we don't renew, the sky will fall, because every contract that we have put out there will dissolve if these powers dissolve. And so all the protections for affordable housing, this and that. And we don't have an inventory, so we don't even know what contracts are out there. So we kind of said the compromise is 6 years, and there are milestones along the way. In the first 2 years, you need to finish the inventory of what contracts are out there. By year 3, you need to figure out what you're going to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now we're up to 2022. And to be honest, it's hard because the council changes over every 2 years, right? So there aren't that many people who were around in that first round. You know, I'm now the third most senior councilor, having been elected in 2013. So I think it's really tying what these powers are to where the city wants to go, and that fundamentally Boston's issues are not about lack of funding, about lack of ideas. It comes down to power sharing and who gets to be at the table, and the BRA represents closing of those doors, and we will never get to true community engagement while they are in charge.
So if I understand correctly, so if you, let's say that this inventorying of the housing and the affordable housing and all that stuff happens, that's like a data transfer, right, to some other system. Do you I don't want to say have a replacement for the BPDA, but like what would, if let's say we could abolish the BPDA with this, ideally all this this knowledge transfer that's been gone haywire over the years, what would you see as a better solution?
Yeah, so, I think this issue has come up again and again and again, and oftentimes the conclusion will be, this is too hard because the state has to do it for us, and, it's going to be just too many steps, so we're not going to do it. Why I really wanted to do that report was to demonstrate how far we could go just at the city level without involving the state. So tomorrow, or at the next meeting of the BPDA, the current board members could take a vote to transfer all the property that they own instead of the city back to the city of Boston, back to the sort of city books. That property would immediately start generating funding to pay for a city planning department. Because right now they say, well, where would planning go? Because we pay for it all. But you give us back the assets, we'll have the money to do the planning and to have it subject to oversight. The planning department then starts to work with community to do a true citywide master plan. We've not done one since 1965. Imagine Boston 2030 is not a citywide master plan. It did not change zoning.
It's more like a vision board. I've read it a few times trying to understand what measurements they're looking for, and it's more of like, it's a park.
It's a Pinterest.
It's a Pinterest page for the city of Boston.
Yeah, and it falls so short from where we could be. I mean, one statistic that I just really hold on to that was in the report also is that the city kind of brags that 15,000 people were engaged through the Imagine Boston 2030 process. When Indianapolis, they're only a little bit bigger than us population-wise, but they had 100,000 people participate in their citywide master planning process. I mean, that's the level that we should aspire to, of who we're talking to about their dreams for Boston, their needs, and how all of that should fit together. Once we have a master plan, that changes zoning. A lot of the city would maybe have higher zoning so there wouldn't be this constant negotiation with every developer. It needs to happen, any sort of upzoning needs to happen with rent control and rent stabilization. We're not just ushering in this flow of gentrification. And then we get to a point where we are holding everyone accountable to that new zoning code.
And I'll say, whatever takes its place, and I really hope the Boston City Council, for whoever's in power for 2022, stays with this vision of abolishing the BPDA. Because what my concerns are when I hear things like, we just hired a new director of inclusion, and now we have this amendment where we're going to study gentrification. Can we have another 10 years? And it needs to be, just going back to one of the themes of last episode and from your op-ed, the power structure. You cannot have the centralized power of a group of people. I can't name you who's on the BPDA, and this is all I do. And so to try to expect like the regular people of Boston who have to work 70 hours a week to make it through, to know who to target is just obscene. So
I mean, I can name all the developers on this.
Oh, I know some of the billionaires who are trying to invest in Dorchester, for example.
Yeah.
But
it's also, I think it's also important to note that most developers would also benefit from moving away from the current system, right? There's a very, very small handful of well-connected, well-networked developers who are able to get more than they probably should in the system. And everyone else, even on the developer side, gets screwed. So this is about moving to something that is consistent, fair across the board, and really reflects what people need. When we ask residents to participate at the very end of the process, when there's really not much participation left, it's stressful. It's a waste of people's time. It's frustrating, and it doesn't get us to the outcomes we need.
It's naming a park while there's maybe 10% of units that are still above the income level for that particular area.
We're going to get some great statues.
Yeah, we're going to get a statue in a park.
But as we talk about maybe getting rid of one institution, let's talk about possibly defunding another one. Which is my segue to the Boston Police Department. So,
my favorite.
Something that also came with the budget that was submitted was a $12 million reduction of the overtime budget. Something that I'm frustrated on is the concentration on the overtime budget, because, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the police can go over the overtime budget and they still get their paychecks.
Legally. Yep.
And so to take money from that kitty, that pot, all Boston police know that pot is limitless, and so take the money from there. Also, it's a bit of a rhetorical trick, because 20%, that sounds like a good chunk. But my understanding is the overtime budget's $60 million. The police budget is $414, which means combining those numbers is 400.
No, so I wanted to point this out because you said that in the last episode too, and I wanted to be like, that's the only one thing. It's technically inside.
Okay, it is.
And that's only a couple years of practice, because it used to be that overtime was not accounted for it's sort of random to, kind of counterintuitive to see overtime inside budgeted overtime, right? But because it had just run way over, tens of millions of dollars over budget every single year, the goal was, well, if there's a specific line item, then it will, maybe this will rein in, it will create more pressure to measure it properly, to manage it properly, but it still runs over even the line item.
And that throws off my fractions a little bit. But another way of saying 20% of the OT budget, just doing some quick math here, that only equals 3%, 12 million of the total budget.
And in fact, of the 12, 2 is redirected within BPD, so it's really just 10. I mean, not to mess up your numbers even more, but 10 leaving BPD.
So the big concession was 2.8% of the police budget, which they get anyway. So we got $10 million to some social services. And so I just wanted to point that out, because I really want people, when they talk about this, to talk about the whole budget, and we should not be obsessing about the overtime budget. And hit me, Lauren, because I know you had questions about the police as well. But that does kind of bring us to the next question, which is how hard it's been for city council members to even talk about the Boston Police Department in anything but a negative light. And many council members have accepted campaign donations from the Boston Police Union, yourself being one of them. Do you plan to continue taking donations, or would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, so I have, in my 7 years now in the council, received 3 donated. We went back through all of our records, scouring it very carefully. So I've gotten 3 contributions from police unions in that time, totaling, I think it was $1,250. And for me, I'm clear every single day. I'm leading based on my values. I'm not affected by contributions that I get, and often I'm taking positions that I'm sure various entities giving contributions would disagree with, and sometimes there is pressure just to give to someone they think is going to be in office, and then that person is able to run the campaign and do use the funding to support community organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, I'm 100% clear. I'm never influenced by campaign money, et cetera. But this moment is one, this issue drove the entire council budget discussion. This is the issue not just of what sort of law enforcement we want to have, how we want to make people feel safe, but also how much we can trust our government. And for me, that is more fundamental than anything else. I want my constituents to know that there's no question whose side I'm on, and when I am taking action for constituents rather than special interests. So I am, fully committed to not taking any more police union contributions moving forward. This is important for me. Again, not that it was influencing me anyway, but to put trust first and foremost, and to make sure that constituents know that that is something that I truly value.
Sorry, I want to get there because not that I don't want to say, I'm not trying to be negative. I do have a slight bone to pick about last year because I was assaulted at Straight Pride by police officers, as well as many of my friends, tear gas, pepper sprayed. And I felt that, along with a lot of people that I was there with, that you were quite silent on the issue. And I want to know, have you those tapes, and have you, maybe I haven't maybe you've spoke out on it since, but I do recall a lot of us being like, wow, Michelle Wu's like kind of back in the cops here after like we're like, getting our legs, like hurt and getting arrested and everything. Have you reviewed those videos, and have you sort of come to a different conclusion about police violence against protesters? Because I am an avid protester who often a subject of police violence.
Yeah, I've had many, many conversations since then, and sat down with activists who were there and people who received emails from family members of those who came home with concussions, knocked down, unprovoked. And so I think for me, it was just a really big lesson of like, I wasn't there.
Right.
And one, I should have been there, right? I probably should have been there.
It wasn't it wasn't that nice.
That day I actually was very sick and was like in bed, and so missed out on following it in real time, I think. And then so going back and trying to figure out what happened and not having the right sort of scale of conversations. I go back to a place where I feel leaders need to first and foremost experience, or at least stand with people who are experiencing it on the ground. And that was just a very big lesson for me, that like, I totally misread that situation.
Yeah, that's understandable. It was also an extreme situation because there were a lot of, I don't know if Boston City Council is in control of a situation where a ton of other police from out of the city were there. Like, is that something that you guys can have control over? Like, can you please not call in like Salem Police Department for a protest next time?
Yeah, so part of the recent analysis that I've been pushing with is to get those information, get the specific details on how many times those what are called metro law enforcement councils are deployed, because they're often, we can have a conversation about what training means and all of that, but it is a very different experience to come in from outside the city and usually in full gear, and see their role as very differently than our Boston police. So we need to go through those records much more closely, but when that happens, it is there's just such a higher risk of conflict and harm and frankly loss of life. That we know the data shows that more heavily militarized police departments are more likely to kill civilians. That's just the bottom line. And so as we move towards how we demilitarize Boston police, that is not just about equipment and our own tactics and how the SWAT team, et cetera, has been deployed, but when we are partnering with these outside entities.
Interesting. And also, just to clarify, did you just take the no cop money pledge?
Yeah, yes.
Hell yeah. All right. Mike Connolly be happy to hear about that. He's always asking what's going on with that, even though he's not really Boston.
And
No cop money.
I'm very cognizant of the time, and we have to go with the police union contracts that are coming up. So
Took the words out of my mouth, Evan.
well, I said it hit me. You just airing this, I didn't know what that meant. So
We're like jumping at the questions here.
so we have the 4 major police union contracts are all up. It's my understanding that they are currently in negotiations with the mayor's office, and that new contract will be submitted, and it needs to be approved by the Boston City Council. Is that correct?
So again, we're responsible for funding. So we could technically, we don't get to say like, yes, this is what the contract's going to be, or no. But we could say we're not going to provide the funding to back up the amount that you've agreed on with the contracting, assuming they come to agreement. The place where the council has more direct involvement is if they don't come to agreement, because for our public safety unions, since they are legally not allowed to go on strike, they go to arbitration instead when they don't come to terms. And then that arbitrator's decision comes back to the council for review.
So I anticipate, and I'm sure you do too, possibly, that they will reach an agreement, the mayor's office and the police. And so what will be submitted to you, as you just outlined, and again, please correct me, is that the city council vote on that is not so much as to the union contract, the letters written, but the funding for it, which still gives power.
Yes, yes.
For me, I would rather have
Yep.
power over the budget than the actual letters and words. So what are you looking for in this police union contract? What do you plan to do in this question once you receive it? Meaning, what will educate your decision about whether or not to award that funding?
Yeah, so I guess I want to back up and just say that when we are having conversations about funding for the police department as a whole and defunding the police department as a whole, it is largely, it boils down to positions and personnel. 95+% of the funding for the department is for costs associated with salaries, wages, benefits, people, positions, and then there's some, a little on top of that for equipment that is also contractually defined. So, except for overtime, which is kind of sort of imaginary line item, if we were to say we're going to defund the non-overtime parts of the budget by 15%, we are talking about reducing positions. So the question for the contracts is, that is the vehicle for how to do that. And there are a couple ways to do that. One is to really define what the role of law enforcement should be in our city. There's an ordinance on the table that I've introduced with Councilor Edwards and Councilor Mejia about alternative 911, so diverting nonviolent calls to an unarmed, trained crisis response system. There are also many positions in the police department that could be civilianized, that police sworn officers are performing, and questions about where resources are going, conversations about overtime and when it is legally mandated to be how much, right? So right now, if you set foot in a courtroom, whether or not your case ends up being heard as that police officer, you're taking that 4 hours of overtime. And if you only end up using 15 minutes of that time that you blocked off, you're actually legally allowed to then turn around and go work a paid detail for the rest of the 3 hours or whatever it is. So there's lots of places, thinking about the paid details that are given out to officers and the structure of that relative to the city. Right now, the city fronts the money, so we pay the officers directly, and the developer, whoever it is who is requesting it, is supposed to pay back the city, to afterwards. But that doesn't, we're not asking all the time whether all that money comes back to us. So there are lots of places within the budget that need to be first analyzed publicly, and then how do we move to a system where we are putting people in the right departments and in the right roles to truly keep people safe?
Couple follow-up questions on that. Let me start with, have you got a BRIC representative to your city council hearings yet?
One came to the face surveillance ban hearing.
Okay. Because I just remember them not showing up.
They didn't come to the grant hearing.
Okay, and
the follow-up has not been scheduled yet.
Okay, all right. And then what do you expect to come of the Boston contracts? Like, do you think there's going to be any change? Like, what do you,
I mean,
good or bad? Like, what do you expect that you can actually get done with this, or that people can actually get done? Because
so
there's a lot of things you just mentioned that would be great.
I know,
but-
I know. It's difficult when the council doesn't even have a window into sort of what's happening in real time. So a number of my colleagues are putting out. They filed a hearing order. I don't remember the exact names. I know Kenzie Bach is involved with it. Maybe it was Andrea Campbell and it was Matt O'Malley. I can't remember. But a batch of colleagues has said we're going to hold hearings. So while this is ongoing, we're going to try to have conversations. Again, in my 6 years on the council, I know we get a lot of answers of we'll get back to you, or we can't share that information right now. So it's good to keep the sort of public attention on. I think there should be more call for the administration to say what they are trying, what are the targets that they're going for. That's not it doesn't break any confidentiality, we should know what the goals are and what success would look like for the mayor and the administration. And then, there's a national conversation now about what should be on the bargaining table with police unions. Should discipline even be allowed to be bargained over? Or should it be just focused on wages and benefits like other unions are able to focus on?
And so what will happen in my dream scenario, and we'll fill in the gap in between a second, what will happen if the Boston City Council votes no on allocating the budget for these new police unions? What happens? What is the next step? That's never happened, so we don't know.
So, okay, I imagine that this is all contractually okay. So assuming they came to agreement and it didn't go to an arbitrator and we're just responsible for funding that amount, the council votes it down. It could come out. I mean, the previously I figured it out. So what happens is when new contracts are adjusted, the existing budget is based on what the previous contract said. So oftentimes we'll have these adjustments where the amount that is extra, right? So if it's a 2% cost of living or whatever it is, that comes out of a fund called collective bargaining reserves. So some amount is set aside there for the uncertainty of what might come out of it. So the council's vote is on allocating that additional amount. If that is not approved, it might just be frozen at the previous level until litigation happens or something gets worked out. But it's not as if we're sort of breaking everything down to zero and starting over.
Because as you just outlined and as you were expressing it, I kind of think what will end up happening, which is they are going to do, of course, what is it going to be a very police-friendly union contract that has one or two slight concessions on very minuscule things that really won't affect anything. But if you voted no for it, it would just go back to the previous union contract. And so from their perspective, it's basically a win-win. They either get to do a symbolic new to address, now we're going to ask permission before we choke somebody out or whatever ends
Bigger
up saying.
cages, longer chains.
And so they will win regardless of this.
So that's why it's so important to ongoing in parallel have the legislative conversation too. Right, so everything that's happening at the state right now, the state senate today, I don't even look to see
talking
if
about
it
qualified
The
immunity.
last message I got, they have 66 amendments left to continue debate, and that was about an hour ago.
Okay. So, it's qualified immunity
Yep.
in the Senate bill, but it's also 4 items that the Black and Latino caucus had been pushing around post, right? Certification and decertification, use of force. Shout out to Rep. Liz Miranda for incredible effort to really put a comprehensive bill together. That would change the dynamics of what we're talking about. And then at the city level, passing an ordinance like this 911 diversion as a first step towards redefining roles and moving forward with a civilian review board. These are ways that we start to kind of narrow the scope of what happened, what the question marks are around the budget and the contract.
One of the big things we hear about the powers of the Boston City Council, besides the budget vote, we're not going to belabor that anymore, is that you get to use the office as like a platform, kind of like highlight some issues. So after speaking with you, normally I was going to encourage, no matter what they submit to you, you not going to happen, unfortunately, with the current makeup of the Boston City Council, but you vote no as if that would cause some sort of a penalty. After listening to you, it's possible that that will not be a penalty for it. But I think another good use of the office, and my district council member is Frank Baker, so I really don't get to have these type of conversations with him as I do with you, is to meet with groups like Muslims United for Justice, FTP, Black Lives Matter, Violence in Boston, everyone else, and say, here's the horrible contract the mayor just gave us. What would you have wanted the contract to be? And to really look at what the people's contract with the Boston unions would have looked like. And then using that as a platform to say, here was Marty's vision for police in Boston, here's the people's. And using that as a microphone. So if we don't get to control the budget in the way that I was hoping, at least shaming the current system. That was all the questions I had in my little journey. I can keep going for like another 2 hours.
You can keep going for another 2
hours. Because you mentioned schools. But last question.
All right, let's get into school stuff.
No, very quickly. As long as you're not... I'm waiting for your person to come banging at the door.
I have 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Okay.
What is your position on exam schools in Boston?
I think exam schools and the structure of our high schools is the question that determines whether there's equity in the district. I think the focus on how we allocate a few seats, we need equity in every bit of every corner of institutions, contracts, budgets, etc. But what we don't spend nearly enough time talking about are the thousands of other students that are not at the exam schools. And so when we are structurally grouping a quarter of students into the exam schools, another third into more selective admission pilot schools, and then concentrating our other students, many of whom are students with disabilities or English language learners, new arrivals to the district, in a limited number of very large comprehensive high schools without the resources to and not the appropriate metrics to judge success. It's just, we're essentially throwing away thousands of our students every year. And so structurally, this is what we need to solve. How do we make sure that it's not just a conversation every year about allocating a few seats in the most fair way or the least painful way, because we're, by doing so, acknowledging that the rest of the seats are not those quality seats. So anyway,
I won't demand a yes or a no, but my comment as a former educator is exam schools should be abolished and should not exist. It is a solution to a problem of cities when you have rich people living in close proximity to poor people. And how do you have a public school program that will keep them segregated? And a way of doing that is to have an exam test, because of all the natural benefits that come from wealth. And we see this in all of the racial breakdowns, class breakdowns of exam schools like Boston Latin, is that it is a way of weeding out so that the rich elite of one area do not have to actually go to school with the people who live 2 miles away.
Well, we're in a real test this year, I think, for the district, because nationally, even universities and those who typically administer standardized tests, right? So all sorts of questions about the effectiveness, etc. But even those systems have said we recognize the depth of trauma that our students are experiencing and how disproportionately this pandemic has affected students of color. So we are suspending the SAT. We're not using that this year. And so for Boston not to take that similar, very small step to recognize the depth of inequity that we would be perpetuating is, I think there's still time to change that decision, but I'm standing strongly with community organizations and advocates who are calling for that not to happen this year.
Yeah, that would be a big win if.
Yeah, how about like.
And I mean, I'll take it with COVID if they can suspend it for just this year. But we're 1 minute over at 8. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We got so much information out of you. I'm not going to ask you that obvious question that everybody's told me not to ask. So maybe another time. But you did a great job. We got a lot of answers, and we would love to have you back on in the future.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And keep us posted on everything Boston City Council. You've been kind of leading the charge lately, which we appreciate.
What you both.
Thank you.
I know we're still live right now.
Let's just sign off?
Up to you.
I'm going to sign off, all right? This was Renters Radio Boston. Like, subscribe, follow us, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Twitch, Twitchtagram, YouTubestan. I don't know. We're Renters Radio everywhere.
All right.
You can also like and subscribe, follow our podcast. We'll be releasing the show tomorrow. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, reach out, concerns. You want to get mad at me, you want to get mad at him, you want to get mad at her, feel free to DM me, feel free to email me, rentersradio@gmail.com. Also, we're on all the social media, like I said. If you want to send us money, you can also send money to the Patreon. I haven't checked it in a while, but we're patreon.com/rentersradio. I don't have a job. I could sure use it. Anyway, take care, everyone. Have a great night. This was Renters Radio with Boston City